talking about the tabernacle is something that has always interested me because of the simple fact of what it means. When you look at the tabernacle and you look at the way things were orchestrated by God in the wilderness, it was made for certain purposes. As we go along, you'll start seeing some of the purposes. No purpose more important than to point to the ultimate sacrifice that was going to later be in Christ Jesus. Because without his people understanding the direct attributes of God through the tabernacle, they can never understand the attributes of Jesus. God showed his people that he wanted to dwell with them by giving them a place to come and meet him. It's in the same way Jesus came and dwelt among us. We're going to read in a few minutes and you'll see, but the same word dwell that it talks about Jesus came and dwelt among his people is the same word in the Old Testament that is used when God came and dwelt in the tabernacle. So we can understand how important it is to understand how God made time for his people in the same way that Jesus made time for the people to come and be that sacrifice that we needed. So like I said, a lot of this is going to be teaching. We're going to go through later. If you have questions, we can answer it. But I just want you to engage your mind, because this is going to take your mind being engaged. If you just sit back and just watch the screen and just kind of listen, you're going to miss half the stuff that comes by, because there's so much information. There's so much prophetic insight. There's so much messianic insight. And if you don't tune your mind in, you miss it quick. The first thing you're going to see right in the middle is you're going to see the tabernacle itself. Now, the tabernacle is not the outside and the building inside together. The tabernacle was actually just meant to be the name of the building where God dwelt. So all the other things we're going to see how they incorporate into the tabernacle, but the tabernacle itself is only the building, the tent that is in the middle of the yard. Okay? We're going to talk about later on about the priestly garment, about how that because of the garments that the priests wore, it actually represented the tribes of Israel, in turn representing Christ and who he was going to be for them. We're going to talk about the worship and how the instruments that they used performed worship and the etiquette of worship inside of the tabernacle. If we look at the etiquette of worship today in church, if it was in those days, a lot of people wouldn't walk out of church, because in those days it was uniform. Everything had to be the same. If one person worshiped different than another, they didn't walk out. God expected a certain quality of worship, and you didn't go in there and give him anything but that quality of worship. We're going to talk about the furniture, the menorahs, the table of showbread, the Ark of the Covenant, the incense altar, the laver, and of course the burnt offering altar. We'll talk about how the tribes lined up around the tent, because it was to be done in order. Everything was done in order. There was nothing that was done in that time that wasn't done in order. So I think you're going to really enjoy this. Let's go to the next one, which is a color picture of the tabernacle itself. As you can see right here in the front you had the entrance to the tabernacle. You would come into the entrance, you would have the outer court. The outer court was the place where people could come in, they could bring their sacrifices. They would come in, they would meet the priest with their sacrifices, the priest would sacrifice for them. On past the burnt offering altar, you have the laver, where they would wash, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Then you would have the tent, which is the tabernacle. When you first walk into the tabernacle, as we'll see in a minute, there's actually two parts. There's a part called the holy place. The holy place was a place that priests could go in. And you hear me say priests is plural, because there were several priests that could go into the holy place. But then the most holy place was beyond the veil. I like this. See, Pastor Tom is on top of it. When you walk in the front, this is where the priests could go. You would have your table of showbread on the right. You would have your menorah on the left. And then in front, you would have the altar of incense. The altar of incense was so that God could not smell your stink. The stink of your sin. Because it talks about in the Bible how that the very smell of your sin repulsed him. So there was an altar of incense that burned day and night. Never went out. So that it was a sweet aroma, as the Bible talks about in Psalms, to his smell. All right, so we're kind of getting an overview. I like this picture right here. This is the altar. As you see the tents lined up around it, this is how they set up camp when God would stop. When the cloud of God moved, they moved. The tent moved. The tabernacle moved. Everything moved. When the cloud stopped, they stopped. They set it up. They set up camp in the way they were supposed to. And then the glory of God would dwell inside of the tabernacle. Now, if you look at the first page, of course, you saw the page that we have in here for you that was the actual front cover page that has pretty much everything we're going to be talking about. But if you go on past that page to the next page, you're going to see the furniture of the tabernacle, which is just talked about. On your own time, you can look over this. You can even read their scriptures on the pictures themselves. You can actually see what each thing means and go into more depth and detail on your own time and be able to read. I want to start off by explaining to you that tabernacle means tent, place of dwelling or sanctuary. It was a sacred place where God chose to meet his people, who were the Israelites, during the 40 years they wandered in the desert under Moses' leadership. It was a place where the leaders and people came together to worship and to come and offer sacrifices. We've already talked about that. The tabernacle was first erected in the wilderness exactly 1 year after Passover. The first Passover. Do you remember the first Passover? What happened on the first Passover? The blood was put over the doorposts. They were able to walk out of Egypt unharmed, without even the army following them until they got so far, then they ended up coming after them. But the blood on the doorposts that represent Passover was when the death angel came. And what happened there was the blood of the lamb kept the angel from taking the life of the firstborn of every Israelite family. Because of that, they got to live when the whole nation of Egypt lost every firstborn of all their households. So this was a very important day. Passover today, even in Israel, is still the most important day of the year. Passover is a special time to the Hebrew people. So when you look at this and you see that exactly 1 year after the Israelites were freed from Egyptian slavery, they put up this tabernacle. It was a mobile tent with portable furniture that people traveled with and set up wherever they pitched camp. The tabernacle would be in the center of the camp, and the 12 tribes of Israel would set up their tents around it according to the tribe. So, if we go back to that one screen that we were on where they were pitched camp around and the glory of God was dwelling, you can see that it's almost in uniform. Each tribe, 3 tribes on one side, 3 tribes on the other, 2 on each end. And then up close to the tabernacle, you would have the priests and the Levites separated by themselves. So you lived in the company of your family, of your tribe. You didn't mix tribes. You didn't go over here and say, well, I like so-and-so from this tribe, so I'm going to go over here and stay in their tribe. No, you didn't get to do that. You had to live in the tribe that you came from. All right? Now, if we look in Exodus, if you see right here, I've put some scriptures in that talk about some different things. And first thing is it says, God talking to his people said, make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. That's in Exodus 25:8. And then it says, then I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God. They will know that I am the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them. That's Exodus 29:45 through 46. So God dwelled among his people in the tabernacle in the wilderness, okay? He appeared as a pillar of cloud over the tabernacle by day and a pillar of fire by night in the sight of Israel. The people would not set out on their journey unless the cloud lifted. It was an unmistakable, powerful visual statement. indicating God's presence among people. God knew that the Israelites needed visual evidence of his presence. When Moses went up to the Mount Sinai for 40 days and the people did not see or hear from him, they grew impatient, gathered their gold, and formed a golden calf that they worshiped in the place of God. That's kind of just like we are today. If we don't feel like God is in the middle of our life and in the middle of everything that we're doing, then we start looking to other things to fill our life. My God, I know this probably better than any of you, because I've had so many things that I've tried to take and fill my life with because I allowed the presence of God to move out. But see, they didn't have that choice. The presence of God stayed because he wanted to make a point to let them know that no matter what you're going through, no matter who's coming after you, no matter what battle you got coming next, I'm here. But the only way to keep me dwelling here is to keep every command that I've given you. Wow. Now, we can stop right there, and I can just tell you that if I had to live by that law, I probably wouldn't be teaching y'all today. That's just to be honest. The reason that I get to stand up here and teach y'all today is because grace, because of what God's done in my life, not because I had to keep a certain set of laws. But these people, to keep his presence with them, had to perform to a certain expectation. If they at any time went too far or not far enough from God, then they would lose what God had given them. The cloud would disappear and they would be without God. And then you would see kings come in and take them and put them into slavery. And it would take the crying out of a few to finally get God to say, you know what, I'll come back and dwell amongst you again. And that's what happened over and over again. After 10 generations of living in Egypt, it was not surprising that the Israelites mimicked the Egyptians in fashioning a visual idol of their own. The act of disobedience with this golden calf demonstrated their need to follow and worship a God who was visually tangible. God's provision of a tabernacle, itself a splendor to behold, not only allowed the people to sense his presence, but also to see the leader go in to meet with God in a concrete place and not disappear up in a mountain. See, you have to kind of understand where they're coming from. When they left Egypt, they left after 400 years of slavery. They get to a place to where they finally feel like they've escaped Pharaoh, the wrath that he was trying to bring. And the next thing you know, the guy who brought them out disappears. 40 days. Nobody knows where he's at. Now, if that was me, it'd make me feel a little uncomfortable. My leader just left. I don't know where he is. We don't have any other leaders around here. I start seeing people starting to get fleshly. They're wanting to build idols. They're wanting to do these things. And I know that, we've been worshiping idols in Egypt, but I know this God, he's a God who wants us to follow him. So it was an unsettling time. So what God said was, there's no more of this. I'm going to actually give you a place, a tangible place, that you can see me, that you can know I'm there, and you can know that I've appointed someone to meet with me on your behalf. Now, I will stop real quick on this part, and I will explain to you that it didn't have to be like that. When Moses came down from the mountain, God came down with Moses, and God was going to address the whole nation of Israel. He was going to give them all a chance to have a relationship with him. But they turned their heads and said, no, Moses, we don't want that. You go talk to him for us. Because they were scared of God. So all this was implemented because of the fact that they were too afraid of this God, the God that just saved them, the God that just brought them out of everything that had been wrong in their lives for 400 years, brought them out of it, brought them into peace, prosperity, was taking them to a place that flowed with milk and honey, but they were scared to talk to him. They were scared to interact with him. So God says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have to just bring a person in that I can actually implement my laws unto so that you can know how I feel. And that's what he done. That's what he did. So the tabernacle was more than just a dwelling place. All the components of the tabernacle were part of an intricate visual aid to illustrate God's relationship with his people. One aspect of this relationship was God's requirement for complete obedience, which we just talked about. God told Moses to create the tabernacle exactly the way he commanded it. It was not to be strayed from God's blueprint. Exodus 25:9 says, make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. Now, I want to talk a little bit first about the plan of the tabernacle and how worship and how people acted around the tabernacle, okay? Now, if you look on this next page where I have this illustrated page, you can see that when you came in the gate, which was the altar, was right in front of the gate. You had the brass wash bowl, which was called the laver. You go into the holy place. We already talked about the candlestick and the showbread, the altar of incense. Holy of Holies had the Ark of the Covenant. But now, here was the flow of worship when you came in. See, I love it when Pastor Tommy, every Sunday, he talks about us coming in, and it takes us 3 songs in worship before we're ready to really praise God, before we're really ready to get things on with God and to be ready to receive from God what He has for us. Well, see, these people couldn't do it like that, because if they walked in that sense of where they were in their mindset, if they walked in not ready to receive from God, they didn't walk out. That was it. You fell dead in the doorstep. So when you entered, the first thing you had to do was you had to walk in and you had to sacrifice and confess your sin. You walked in with your sacrifice. You brought it to the priest. You confessed that you have sinned, that you are a sinner, and that you want to be able to give this offering unto God as a sacrifice to stay the punishment of your sin. Now, after you did this, nobody else could go further than that, but the priest could. The priest could go from the altar of burnt offering. They could go past, because after they were done doing all the sin offering, after all that sin was on them, then they had to go and they had to wash. Cleansing and forgiveness was the next place they had to go. They had to be cleansed before they could even walk into the holy place of God. So when they walked in and then they would come in to the holy place, it was a time of worship. As soon as they walked into the holy place, they begin to worship. They begin to worship, and the candles were, again, we're going to go into these things, but the candles were a part of worship. The showbread and the wine was a certain part of worship. The altar of incense was a certain part of worship. But everything they did inside of this place was worship God. There wasn't no time to do anything but. Then when you get past there and you get past the veil, you actually get to the place where you have an encounter with God. Now, the Bible in Psalms, it talks about entering into His house with thanksgiving and into His courts with praise. Well, the reason why the psalmist David wrote that is because he understood what God wanted from us when we came into His house. Because the first thing we do when we come into the place of God, into the outer court, into where we're going to come into worship, we come in with thanksgiving and praise, because we're never going to have a chance to have a real encounter with God inside the holy place unless we come in with thanksgiving and praise. That's a lot of times the reason why when you hear people lead praise and worship, you hear people lead praise and worship with songs that are thanking God, and you're giving God praise, and you're getting people's hearts ready to receive something from God, and then it comes into a time when you really try to break in and have a real encounter with God. Well, there's a reason why worship has flowed like that, because that's how worship has always flowed. From the day worship began, worship has flowed like that. And you go, well, man, I just don't know if I like the way of worship like that. Well, between you and God. But what I know is that God told the people then, you come in with thanksgiving and praise. If you don't come in with thanksgiving and praise, you ain't going to make it to the point of having an encounter with me. So you ain't even got to worry about that. It's a point of being serious with God. And we can have things and we can have times when we play. I mean, man, we all like to joke. We all like to play. But there's a time when you come in and you're serious with God. I don't care how many times the kids slapped you in the face that morning. I don't care how many times the wife told you ain't worth nothing. That it's your fault y'all are late to church. Right, Bryce? Or other way around, whoever, you know. No matter how many times you had these things going on, when you come in, God says it's a time to stop that. It's a time to come in with a mind of worship and praise for me. It's about me now. That's hard. That's hard, guys. Yeah, I'm not standing up here like, hey, like this is easy, because this ain't easy. It's one of the hardest things we do. It's one of the hardest things we do is walk in. It talks about taking off the spirit of heaviness. You know what the spirit of heaviness is? The spirit of heaviness is the thing that keeps you weighed down all week long until you get into the house of God. And then whenever you get here, you finally start relieving that spirit of heaviness, but it takes you 2 hours to do it. No, we should get rid of the spirit of heaviness before we come in so that God has ample time to really do a work in us, to really make something change in our life. So that was the flow of worship in the tabernacle. To this end, God gave very specific instructions about the size of each component, the materials the Israelites were to use, as we still see in the following sections. We're going to discuss some of them. Now, these seemingly are cumbersome rules, which not intended to burden the people, but to show God's unquestionable authority and holiness. God didn't do this to the people so he could say, look, I want to make life hard for you. So what you got to do is you got to come in, you got to wash, you got to, and later on in the New Testament you hear Jesus talking about it. Come on, really? You're going to get on to these guys because they're not washing? It wasn't to sit there and give you something to be burdensome about. He wasn't trying to burden you down. What he was trying to show you with is that my authority and my holiness is above anything you have, anything you can bring, which is the same thing Jesus did for us. Because none of our holiness, it says our holiness is what? Filthy rags. So, but basically what they want to do is they want to emphasize that people can not only come to God, but they had to come to God on God's terms, not on their terms. All right? They had to obey reverently, not only the construction of the tabernacle, but also the way they worshiped. Any irreverence or ritual uncleanness could result from an individual being cut off from his people or in death itself. For example, the anointing oil that was used for the tabernacle and the incense for the altar of incense, it was made by God's own prescribed formulas of spices. And they were both declared holy by God and could only be used for the purpose of the tabernacle. Anyone else who used these in the same formula for their own consumption would be cut off from Israel. You couldn't take the spices that were used, even though some of these spices were used in cooking and other things. You cannot take and mix these spices the way that they were used inside of the tabernacle in any other way than for worship. If you use them in any other reason but for worship, you were cut off from the people. You were made unclean. You weren't allowed to come around the other people of God. You had to stay. It was like you were almost a leper. And guys, don't feel like I'm judging or I'm showing like God is so judgmental and this and that. This is talking and trying to explain to you what He is to know what we came from. Because of Him being this way, He had to give us another route. Do you understand that? Because of who He is, there was no way that we could possibly achieve what He wanted us to achieve. Paul later on said, how can we put something on them that we've never been able to keep? How can we do it? We can't, because we ain't even been able to keep it. But what we're talking about is a type and shadow of God's nature combined with human frailty. Who humans were at that time and who humans still are today. We're frail in our own nature, but because of the strength of God, we're made strong. It's not because of our strength. And that's what He's trying to show them. It's not because of your strength, it's because of my authority. It's because of my righteousness that you get to even have this tent. In the same way that it's only because of His righteousness and His authority that we get to have salvation. Right? In the New Testament, John writes, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Is that not what it says? This word dwelling in the same word for tabernacle in the Old Testament. So in other words, God came in living flesh to dwell or to tabernacle among his people. As he walked upon the earth and lived among the Jews, Jesus Christ himself fulfilled the picture of the Old Testament tabernacle in that and many other ways, as we will see in the tabernacle, really was a prophetic projection of the Lord's redemptive plan for his people. Revelation 21:3 says, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He was going to live with them. He had a plan to live with them before, but they didn't want that. They were scared, so they wanted somebody else, like we said a while ago, to take the role of having the relationship. He wanted it before. God didn't want to be a rude person to anybody. He didn't want to be a taskmaster. There, that's a good word. But because the people refused to have a relationship with him, he had to make sure that he did what he needed to do to keep his presence with them. Amen.